Hello, Politics Plus Media 101 listeners. John Gunnison and I are back at it again, and today we have a show on political corruption with Matt K. Lewis, columnist at the Daily Beast, podcaster, and author of Filthy Rich Politicians, which is actually out today, and you can purchase the book by going to our show notes and clicking on the link right there. So Matt, I want to first thank you for joining us and also get into your book a little bit. I was reading your book and it is fascinating. It's something that everybody should read. And you brought up the William J. Jefferson case. For our audience, it's a former member of Congress from Louisiana, a Democrat, I believe, who was found having $90,000 in cold hard cash, so to speak, in his freezer in a pie crust when the FBI raided his house. I think that this is a really good example to look into because after all of this corruption was made public, he was then reelected. Why does the public seem to not care even about the most egregious cases of political corruption?
Well, it's interesting. I think the public cares in the sense that I think that there is a sense that the game is rigged and that our politicians are using their perch to feather their nest. And I do think that is eroding trust in Congress and in elites and institutions. And that's a huge problem. But what I don't think they do often is actually punish filthy rich politicians themselves at the ballot box for this. And so, yeah, it's sort of a schizophrenic reaction. I think, generally speaking, the public has a sense that the game is rigged. It is causing us to not trust our government, really, to lose faith in liberal democracy to a certain degree, certainly in Congress. And yet we don't punish the actual, perpetrators at the ballot box. And in fact, they tend to actually excel, as it were.
Matt, when we talk about the public sentiment towards this topic, there's one big question that I think your book is trying to address and try to answer that is a pretty common one. And that's, how do politicians who spend their entire career in public service end up getting rich, right? People like Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, Mitch McConnell, they've spent decades in public service. It's really their whole career. If their CV would show one or two jobs, mostly as a member of Congress or a senator. And somehow, even though they've been serving in positions that pay something like $180,000 a year, many of them have become multimillionaires. How does that happen, Matt? Tell us, how does a person like Nancy Pelosi, who's spent her whole career in public service, end up rich?
There's different reasons for each person you cited. In the case of Nancy Pelosi, the vast majority of her wealth comes from her husband Paul's stock investments. And I have to say, of all the very shady examples of what looks like insider trading, Nancy Pelosi and Paul Pelosi was responsible for two of the three shadiest, sketchiest examples that I found in writing this book. Things that just look very, very sketchy. I think if Nancy Pelosi, if you took her salary, now the average member of Congress, of the House, makes about $174,000 a year, but Nancy Pelosi was the speaker at different points. And so she was making a little bit more money than that, but not a lot. She would have to earn her salary for about 500 years before she would make enough money to have her current estimated net wealth. And so in her case, it comes from the stock market and certainly things that look to be very sketchy. Joe Biden's actually different. Now, look, I know there's a lot of questions about Joe Biden, and is he the big guy mentioned on Hunter Biden's laptop and all of that. But if we put aside the things that we don't know, the things that have not been proven yet, and we just look at the official, reports that Joe Biden has had to file over the course of the last 4 decades of being in public service, he wasn't wrong when he said he was one of the poorest members of Congress for many years. In fact, I think he was in debt. He had this beautiful house in Delaware. I'm guessing he got it at a pretty good deal back like in the 70s or something. But he he was upside down on mortgages. He did not have very much money until he left the White House as being vice president for Barack Obama. That's when he cashed in. I guess around 2017 is when he made about $15 million with books, speeches, being I'm using scare quotes here, college professor, although I don't think he actually ever taught anybody. So very different cases, but in both instances, and of all, so many members of Congress, they get rich after they get elected. And I think there are several reasons. We've mentioned a couple of them, including allegations of insider trading. Part of the deal is that rich people tend to get elected, and rich people just tend to keep getting richer. The whole saying, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. I mean, someone like a John Hoeven from North Dakota got elected. I think he was worth like $22 million when he was elected, according to his, disclosure reports. And now it's like $44 million. And people think it's a big scandal. Well, like, no, if you have $22 million, you're going to earn a lot of interest and real estate and things like that are going to accrue and you're going to tend to profit just naturally from it. So there's a whole bunch of reasons. Some of them are much more sketchy than others, I would say.
It's funny looking at that Joe Biden example and comparing it to others in its relative sketchiness, Matt, because it does make me think a little bit of Secretary Hillary Clinton. You talked about how when Biden left office, he was really able to start earning a lot of money on the speaking tour, book sales, and so on. And it's interesting to remember that when Joe Biden left the vice presidency, we really did all assume that he was retired from politics. And I think that's a pretty important distinction, isn't it? Because that's sort of the way the system was meant to work, that you retire from politics and then you're able to become kind of a elder statesman and make a bit of money as a consultant or speaking tour. I remember Harry S. Truman was bankrupt after leaving the White House, and Congress thought it was such a disgrace to see an impoverished president. And since then, we've had this situation where retired presidents enjoy a comfortable lifestyle, partly in a consequence of all of this. When Barack Obama gave Joe Biden the Presidential Medal of Freedom in their last official event together, it seemed like it was the end of a career. And I think that's part of why many of us haven't been quite as concerned about Biden's business activity after leaving the vice presidency, because we really did believe, and I think he kind of believed too at the time, and all of the people associating with him, that he wasn't going to come back into office. And that's so different from Secretary Clinton and former President Trump, because they announced very publicly their intent to seek office again when they went into that period of hiatus from public office. So everyone who was giving them money in that interim did it hoping that they were influencing a future president. And that's a pretty important distinction, isn't it?
It totally is. And I would say, filthy rich politicians doesn't just look at why the rich get elected and the elected get rich. It also goes into why they keep cashing in even after leaving political office, right? In some cases, that's lobbying. Something like a quarter to a third of members of Congress take that revolving door and keep cashing in as lobbyists. We also have now a lot of them are keeping money from their campaign accounts and kind of rolling that over into political action committees where they can continue to give out money to politicians and use some of that to finance a pretty nice lifestyle for themselves. And of course, we have things like foundations. And the Clintons are probably, well, I don't even think probably, the Clintons really, I think, leveraged that more than anybody else. And, it's hard to say you can't have a foundation. I'm sure they did a lot of great philanthropic work. Bill Clinton obviously was president for 8 years. But where it gets, just very swampy is what you were talking about, right? Where everybody knew Hillary Clinton wasn't just going to run, but that she was going to be the front runner for the Democratic nomination. And everybody thought, incorrectly, but everyone thought she would very likely be the next president, right, in 2016. And so there were years where people were giving money to the Clinton Foundation, and not just people, but like foreign governments were giving money. And they knew, at least they thought they knew, that they were giving money to the person who was going to be the president of the United States, a very powerful person. I mean, so that is so so corrupt and so corrosive. And it's really hard to look at that and not find it just really scummy and disturbing. And, I'm not a fan of Donald Trump by any stretch, but there were a lot of people who were really turned off to the Clintons. And I think this kind of behavior is one of the many reasons why a lot of people could not bring themselves to vote for Hillary.
Well, just as a reminder to our listeners, despite working for the RNC in 2016, I did vote for Hillary because it was always going to be worse on the Trump side of the aisle. But Matt, I do want to ask you, filthy rich politicians basically going through the legal ways of corruption, right? Unethical dealings. How do you go about selecting the examples you use in the book? Because it's and Marjorie Taylor Greene to AOC, and I won't list them all. But as somebody involved in politics like myself, like you are, I would be really tempted to just focus on the people that I don't like.
Yeah. Well, it's easy for me. I don't like any of them. I've become very jaded and cynical about politicians over the years. I used to be something of a fanboy for a certain type of optimistic, conservative Paul Ryan, Tim Scott, Marco Rubio, Ben Sasse, but they've all disenchanted me and disappointed me so much that I kind of don't like any politician. And by the way, not only have I been a political operative many years ago in my past life, but my wife is now. And I've seen how some of them have treated her and how some of them have turned out. And so I basically don't pull any punches and I just go where the stories take me. And, but I do think one of the interesting things about this book is that obviously Donald Trump's in the book, Joe Biden's in the book. But I didn't want this to be about Biden or Trump because it's the real story is not about presidents, and it's also not about crazy illegal things happening. It's about the day in, day out corruption. And corruption doesn't have to be illegal. There doesn't have to be a quid pro quo. There's a lot of swampy, sketchy things that are happening. And I wanted to capture that. And there aren't many illegal examples in the book. Most of the things that I talk about are things that happen like through the course of doing politics. They are actually, I think that what we have is basically, a fundamental problem that is intrinsic, and we need serious reforms. And I'm not a populist, some people may read this book and see I'm talking about the fat cats and the swamp creatures and the ruling class. Like, I think it's important if we want to preserve this republic and this great experiment, we have to fix these problems, because the game really is rigged to a certain degree. So we need to fix it. And as I write in the book, I don't want to get to a point where we have people showing up at our doorsteps with torches and lanterns and pitchforks, right? I'd rather have them show up with well-typed resumes. So that's kind of why I wrote it.
And it's funny, Matt, you're talking about the need for reform. It seems as though we're actually moving in the wrong direction on these kinds of issues, right? And a real illustration of that is a case that you write about in the book, and that's the McDonnell case. And that was a case that really resonated with me, partly for some of the other reasons that you mentioned. I mean, you're talking about disillusionment with politicians. Matt, your disappointment with the Marco Rubios and Tim Scotts of the world, and Justin, your experience on the RNC and then voting for the opposite candidate because of what you witnessed. I remember when I was in college in Virginia, I had met Governor McDonnell a couple times, and I thought, maybe this man is going to be a future president. Isn't that exciting? Someone here from the state that I'm living, someone that, I met at a few different events. And then when I witnessed the scandal and all of the fallout, I was so disappointed. I think that the way that the Supreme Court approached the case was kind of a milestone, because McDonnell had been convicted in the criminal courts. They found him guilty of bribery, and the case appeared to be very straightforward. He had accepted lots of gifts and money from a wealthy businessman, and then his office had done favors for that businessman. You had a pretty straightforward exchange, apparently. But what the Supreme Court said was that there was no proof that there was an explicit agreement on the exchange between McDonnell and the businessman. And that is such a remarkably absurd standard to try to put in place. Because in what scenario would we ever be able to catch someone conducting a bribery according to that standard? I mean, are we expecting that people who engage in corrupt influence peddling are writing out on paper, this is our agreement. I will give you money and you will give me this favor? I mean, honestly, even the interest in the quid pro quo to begin with is a little bit wrongheaded, isn't it? Because as we know, these kinds of financial exchanges and influence peddling in the world of politics is often not even targeted on a specific act. It's sometimes more like an insurance payment where the wealthy business person or foreign government are winning favor with a politician in case of emergency, in case their company goes under and they need a bailout, in case their country gets attacked and they need U.S. support, in case there's a revolution and they want to make sure that the president doesn't do what Barack Obama did to Hosni Mubarak. So it's not that they're even focusing a lot of the time on a specific act in the moment. It's that they want to build a positive relationship for any future unforeseen event. And there's no way that we can ever prevent this kind of thing from happening if we are asking what the Supreme Court was asking for.
Yeah. For those who don't remember, and I tried to avoid, I try to avoid things that happened 10 years ago in this book. So most of the book is Ben Franklin, you know what I mean? Like things that happened like 200 years ago or things that are happening right now. Because I just feel like our attention span is so short. So I tried to avoid things that I remember well, like 10 or 12 years ago, right? So Bob McDonnell, I think he was elected in 2009. It was Bob McDonnell and Chris Christie, two governors in two different states. And it was a backlash against the Obama election in 2008. Both of them, Bob McDonnell and Chris Christie, show up in their respective states and have a wind at their back and a lot of hope for them. And yeah, Bob McDonnell I think his wife took a Rolex watch for Bob McDonnell as a gift from a donor. I think there was a donor who basically paid for the McDonnell's daughter's wedding. They might have bought his wife a dress for the inauguration, stuff like that. And one of the interesting things for me was the sense that it was Bob McDonnell's wife who was sort of Lady Macbeth here, she really wanted to live this glamorous life. And even though her husband was the governor of Virginia and at that point was being talked about as possibly getting to run for president, and even though he could have cashed in 4 or 5 years later and made $1 billion as a lobbyist, she felt like she was entitled as the first lady to live this glamorous lifestyle. And they're hobnobbing, of course, with political donors who really are rich. And it's like, well, this guy's got a jet. I'm the governor. I'm smarter than this guy. Or why does this guy have a jet? Why do these people have mansions? And so I get into that sort of temptation, the sense that you're entitled and that you're around all of these wealthy people, and then maybe you deserve that too, and you should live that lifestyle too. But to your point, even at the federal level, when it comes to things like insider trading, let me give you an example here, right? During COVID, when COVID happened, we had all of these members of Congress and U.S. senators who dumped stock. So Senator Richard Burr, who was chair of the Intel Committee, had been briefed on COVID and how bad it was before the American public realized, before the average American realized how bad COVID was really going to be. He dumps hundreds of thousands of dollars of stock. And this is a Republican, by the way, for people who think I'm beating up on Democrats like Pelosi with the insider trading. This is a Republican senator. Before most Americans know how bad this is going to be, he dumps hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of stock in things like Wyndham Hotels, the kinds of things that are not going to fare well in a global pandemic. But not only that, he calls his brother-in-law. Within 1 minute of hanging up with Senator Burr, his brother-in-law picks up the phone, calls his broker, and dumps all of his stock, essentially, right? This was investigated. Burr's phone was actually seized, by like the Department of Justice or whatever. Scot-free. None of the senators, nobody who was involved in what looked very much like shady sketchy insider trading based off of intel they had picked up about COVID was prosecuted. They all completely skated. And I think part of the problem is it is virtually impossible to prove that somebody is engaging in insider trading in Congress, because of course there were, Burr can say, well, my advisor recommended this move, and that probably is true. And he could say, well, there were media reports that COVID was going to be really bad. And of course there were. But yet you were sitting in, classified briefings, hearing things that the average person was not privy to. And you didn't go tell the American public how bad it was. In fact, Donald Trump, your president, the Republican president, was telling everybody it's going to be over in like 15 minutes. So I think that's why we need to ban, for example, just ban stock trading for members of Congress, because we're not going to be able to police it. I think we need to ban it.
Matt, I agree with you about banning the congressional stock trade. And, you're talking about how even though the evidence looks so strong against Burr, he still evaded prosecution. It's funny because the only politician that I remember actually getting convicted of insider trading was Chris Collins of New York. He was convicted not in relation to COVID, but for a case a couple years before. And guess what? Chris Collins was pardoned by Donald Trump. So at every level of the process, no matter how far along you get, you're going to get away with it eventually, right? I mean, there's not enough evidence, then the law is not strong enough, then you even get convicted and you're still going to get away with it because of a pardon. The McDonald case, though, it's a really interesting one, because I think that even if the Supreme Court tried to limit the legal ramifications, we're seeing the effects. I mean, we've seen other cases since then where politicians almost got indicted, almost got charged. And the prosecutor said, because of the precedent in McDonald, I don't think that we're going to be able to get a conviction. I think that prosecutors in New Jersey made that determination when they were looking at Bob Menendez, U.S. Senator for New Jersey, who was involved in similar allegations. And we also look at the way that the Supreme Court, in its current incarnation, has been approaching ethical issues generally. I mean, we saw, of course, the landmark Citizens United decision, which demonstrated an attitude towards money in politics that was so much more permissive than any regime or framework that we've had in the United States before. And in recent months, we've seen these ethics scandals, especially in regard to Justices Thomas and Alito. And we've seen the attitudes of the justices and the way they respond to them. And it is this unsophisticated theory about bribery, just like we saw in the McDonald case, where they said, yes, we've got gifts. No, you can't tie it to any specific quid pro quo. And that's all that matters. And then I think in Alito's case, they even did find something that looked like a quid pro quo, and he still wanted to dismiss it. With Thomas was found to have had a billionaire, Harlan Crow, pay for his nephew or grandson's school tuition. And he put out a letter trying to respond to these allegations. And he said, yo, you don't understand. I love my nephew. And that's why we did this. I'm doing a good thing. I'm a good person. I'm accepting this bribe because of how much I love my nephew. That once you hear this, isn't going to change the way you look at it. I mean, all it does is explain the rationale behind the transgression that we've identified. And just like you said in the McDonald case, I mean, you can see from a human psychology perspective why people do unethical things, but they're not even really disputing the fact of the matter, are they? They're just saying, I'm a person and I do things because I love my family. I mean, nobody does something bad consciously. I mean, maybe Donald Trump, but almost nobody else does something bad consciously. Everyone has a motivation to break the law. I robbed the bank because my family is starving.
William Jefferson, the guy who actually did do something illegal, the cold hard cash in his freezer. And it turns out his motive was apparently that he wanted to be able to send, I think it was his daughters, to an Ivy League school or to a more prestigious school. So even he had something of a noble motivation for doing some really illegal, stuff. Yeah, look, I mean, I tell you, I keep coming back to this because there's so many of these, and I get in the book, I get into all these examples But at the end of the day, the reason I think it matters the most, like, I don't care about punishing Sam Alito or whether, the nephew of a Supreme Court justice got to go to a prep school or not. Or, that to me is not the big thing. The big thing is that it looks to the American public, whether right or not, whether true or not, it looks like members of the Supreme Court and U.S. senators and congressmen and governors are using their position, their taxpayer-funded position, to personally enrich themselves and their families. And this is having the effect of eroding trust in our country at a time when we need it. We really need it. And that, to me, so what they're doing, when Clarence Thomas does this, okay, I'm willing to believe him that in his mind, he's not doing anything corrupt, that in his mind, he's not going to make any decisions based on these favors or gifts, right? I'm totally willing to believe that. Maybe I'm naive, but it doesn't even matter, because what Clarence Thomas is doing by accepting these gifts is hurting America, because it's hurting the reputation of the Supreme Court, of this institution. People, it looks bad, whether it is or not. It looks bad, and that hurts America. That's unpatriotic in my view, so it pisses me off.
Yeah, and it's not even necessarily the overt act of conflict of interest and corruption. There is implicit conflict of interest, or rather, there is an implicit impact from a conflict of interest, right? If I worked for Seaboard Corporation, which I did as a lobbyist, and then I went into Congress, they're a large agribusiness company, and then I went to advise a congressman on agriculture policy, I was conscious to not try and tip the scales in favor of Seaboard, but they gave me my first job. So naturally, I'm going to be a little bit more receptive to their arguments, because I am going to think that ultimately they're not doing anything malicious and they're trying to be in the best interest of the agriculture sector. But Matt, I wanted to take another look at Democrats, because this case fascinated me, and you cover it in your book. It's Rep. Omar, and it's paying her spouse. So my recollection, and you briefly go over it in your book, is essentially 80% roughly of Rep. Omar's husband's consulting firm's money came from her campaign. Not only did it come from her campaign, she was running relatively unopposed in a deep blue district. So that, to me, is as close to illegal corruption as you can get in the legal sphere.
Well, I think the family thing is interesting. I have a chapter in the book about all in the family, spreading the wealth around, that kind of thing. And I don't think it's not the sexiest chapter. I doubt if I'm going to be asked about it a lot, but I tell you, I think it's one of the most important chapters because of what you just mentioned, right? So let's take Ilhan Omar. So she's running for re-election, and she's incredibly popular. So she's going to be able to raise a lot of money, whether she needs it or not. She's going to be able to raise a lot of money. And then she could take that money, and everybody hires political consultants. I mean, everyone's got a general strategist. If you're running for office, you're going to have a general strategist. You're going to have media advisors. You're going to have pollsters. And so she directs millions of dollars to her husband's consulting firm. Now, at that point, I'm guessing some of that money will be spent on voter contact, on actually running TV ads or sending out voter mail or whatever. But a lot of that money is going to stay with his firm because, hey, he's a professional. Like my wife's a political consultant. She makes money. If you do a good job, you should make money. But he's going to make a lot of money off that client. And that means she's going to make money off of it, right? Because they're married. And so she is basically taking campaign funds and skimming, one could look at it, laundering campaign funds into her own family's bank account. And would she have, if it wasn't her husband's firm, would she have given him the same deal? Maybe she would have paid him a smaller percent. Maybe we don't know. We have to. It's hard. I'm not privy to the details of their arrangement. Like, that's not even public information, but it certainly looks bad. It looks sketchy. And there were a lot of politicians who've done stuff like this. Bernie Sanders is another example of someone who for years has employed his wife, Jane. In fact, before they were married, and there were examples of where he would hire her for things without, even putting out an announcement that there was a job opening. He hired her early on to be his media buyer, even though she's never been a media buyer before, and has paid her a lot of, we're not talking Ilhan Omar money here, but still a lot of money. By the way, Maxine Waters, and I think it was in 2020 alone, she paid her daughter $80,000. Ron Paul employed at least 6 different members of his family on his 2012 presidential race, a grand total of something like $300,000. But I think when it comes to spouses, it's really sketchy, because that's money that is in your own household. You're using either campaign dollars or taxpayer dollars in the case of if you're paying them from your official office, and you're paying someone who you share a bank account with.
I'm also a political consultant, so I say this next little bit not directed at Matt's wife, but the industry of itself, maybe because it's so adjacent, Matt, to the overt corruption that the politicians do, it's pretty sleazy. And I'll use 2 examples. The Lincoln Project, taking aside the John Weaver stuff, the way that they were skimming money and basically stealing money from these small Democratic donors. And they were pretending to make these ads and all of these big buys. And it would just be, some YouTube video that they created. And Steve Schmidt and Rick Wilson were pocketing millions and millions of dollars. I think is pretty unethical. Then Axiom Strategies. There was a recent Washington Post article on this. Axiom Jeff Rowe became really famous because of Ted Cruz. They, I think, said they charge their clients like 35% off the top, depending on who they are and what the services are that they're going to run. And we just focused on 2 progressives, Bernie Sanders and Rep. Omar. So the question is, Matt, you've done a lot of research. You've looked at Republicans and Democrats. Is there any difference in this type of insider wheeling and dealing and corruption that you've noticed between the 2 parties, or is it all just one big game that they're equally in on?
I think it's all just one big game. When it comes to the insider trading, or at least what looks like insider trading, I think Nancy Pelosi is at the top of her game. But everyone does it, sadly. When it comes to the paying families, it seems like Dems are a little bit worse at that, with Ron Paul notwithstanding. But in general, the filthy rich politician phenomenon, the problem is it's a bipartisan phenomenon. I did not see that one party was worse than the other.
Well, I guess on this issue of family members on staff, I mean, the worst example has got to be Donald Trump, his daughter Ivana, and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. I remember in France, there was this very similar scandal to what you're talking about, Matt, where Francois Fillon, who was the nominee for the main center-right party, he had put his wife on staff in a no-show job, making a lot of money, and she never even showed up at the office. He said she was his secretary or something. Not only was he convicted of corruption for this abuse, but it changed the course of French history because his campaign collapsed, and a man who was not part of any of the traditional political parties was able to come up in this insurgent bid and become French president. So, this issue of putting family members on staff, it's something that can change history.
Since you brought it up, let me talk real quick about Biden. And again, the book is not heavy on Biden and Trump, but I will say both of them are in the chapter on spreading the wealth around to the families. And in the case of Trump, it was almost too numerous to mention. I couldn't even touch on most of the instances, but what stands out to me is how Ivanka Trump had, I think, 6 patents that were fast-tracked in China. Kellyanne Conway went out publicly in her role as an advisor to the president promoting Ivanka's products. And then, of course, at the end, we had Jared Kushner getting a $2 billion investment from a Saudi fund, which, speaks for itself. In the case of Joe Biden, the Hunter stuff, I won't even go there, right? Who knows what that'll be. a week from now. But Joe Biden has two brothers, James and Frank, who have both profited and I think exploited for money their relationship with their famous brother. And in fact, in 1988, this is an interesting statistic or fact that I learned from an Atlantic article a few years ago. When Joe Biden ran for president in 1988, he raised over $11 million, and more than 20% of that money went to paying his family. So this is, again, a bipartisan phenomenon.
I mean, this brings me to a question that I wanted to ask you about, Matt, because, I mean, to me, this whole idea of family members exploiting the name and bringing in conflicts of interest to a principal is an interesting one, because it becomes a question of where you kind of draw the line. We all recognize the principal, the member of Congress or whatever, should divest, should not have conflicts. And we're talking a lot about spouses. And it seems pretty clear that there's a lot of problems where spouses are introducing conflicts. We saw that with Paul Pelosi. And so we probably agreed that that should be eliminated. Now we're on to siblings, Joe Biden's siblings. They're exploiting his name. They're cashing in on his name. What do you do there? Is that still a close enough family member where we can put in place a rule? What about cousins?
I don't see how you could stop, a 50-year-old brother from saying something inappropriate. That's just, at some point, you can't really police that. But, in the case of like Joe Biden, there don't seem to be any consequences. Like, I don't think Joe tells Frank, shut up. Don't tell people that, I'm going to help them because they hire you to give a speech. Like, I wish that he would do a better job, and I'm sure he's got his hands full right now. But I think it is incumbent. This kind of goes to one of my themes, which is I think if you love this country, it is incumbent upon you to go out of your way to not only avoid impropriety, but avoid the appearance of impropriety. And you need to get, Clarence Thomas's, this is off topic, but Clarence Thomas's wife being involved in the stuff she's involved in, which doesn't even have anything to do with money, right? It's activism. Like, you need to have a talk, and it's like, this ain't happening. You know what I mean? Like, we just cannot tolerate this. It just is inappropriate. And so has Clarence had that talk with her? I don't know, but man, that's a talk that needs to be had.
So, Matt, I want to ask you about the liberal latte chapter in your book where you mentioned AOC and the student loans. So essentially, she makes too much to qualify for President Biden's initial $20,000 loan forgiveness plan. She has, I don't know, $40,000, $50,000 in student loans. She advocates for wiping out all student loans, and that's a conflict of interest. Now, to me, that example rubbed me the wrong way a little bit, and I want to ask you, is it any different to the member of Congress who's a veteran, who is legislating on increasing the benefits for the Yellow Ribbon program, which, for the listeners, is a program where veterans get free tuition? That has been pared back recently, largely due to Republicans wanting to cut spending. So let's say a Republican member of Congress who fought in the war wants to increase those benefits so that they can get free college. Is that any different than the example that you put in the book of AOC?
Probably not. And the thing with AOC, I don't think it's a capital offense, but I think it deserves mention. I'll tell you one that I think is more concerning to me, or more interesting to me, and that was a squad member, a couple squad members actually, were also landlords, and they were advocating for, making it basically having a moratorium on evictions, right? So landlords could not evict tenants during COVID. And that actually seems to me to be in keeping with a progressive worldview. But what didn't seem to be in keeping with a progressive worldview is that these squad members also were advocating for paying for reimbursing the landlords for the money that they were going to lose because of the moratorium on evictions. That seemed to me to be a little bit out of character of the squad. And it does seem interesting to me that I think two of the squad members are also landlords. So again, doesn't mean that they're self-dealing, but it struck me as interesting.
Yeah, I mean, Matt, if they're real progressives, I mean, this is the no true Scotsman attitude of some of the online left. They should be pushing to abolish landlordism altogether, right?
Yes.
I think that a few of these questions are a little bit complicated. I'm thinking in particular about the revolving door, and I think this is a really tricky one because we can look at the situation of the revolving door and be a bit outraged, sometimes without necessarily considering how it can benefit the way our government works. And I know that sounds really strange, but on the side of private sector to government, you need to have a expertise in your government, right? You need to staff the government with people who understand a field, who understand an industry, who understand some subject matter. So, for example, our agencies that are going to regulate technology, you want to get the smartest people who understand that stuff. Often you're pulling from tech firms. So you're going to end up with people who look like they have a conflict, but are actually the best and most informed people. And then on the other side, when you've got the government to private sector, we can say, oh my goodness, this person is going right from the military to a defense contractor. And, he was probably, when he was making decisions when he was in the military, he was thinking about, I want these companies to like me. I'm trying to get a job there. That's a really concerning conflict. But from the other perspective, we can see that the opportunity to cash in after your public sector career is something that encourages ambitious and capable people of joining public service. When, the money isn't really that great during your career in public service, you might not get the most talented people in the job market to come and take those jobs if there wasn't that, shining light at the end of the tunnel of cashing in the private sector.
I don't know. I don't know if I agree with the premise that it's good that people engage in public service with the understanding that then they can parlay that, the knowledge, the connections, whatever, into making money, especially in lobbying. So I'm not there yet on that. I will say that I'm somewhat open to the concerns that you bring up, which are why one thing I actually recommend in this book that's counterintuitive is that we pay members of Congress more money, not less, that we pay them more. And also, as I write about in the book, even though I am now in favor of term limits and I'm calling for that, for years, I was against term limits. And part of the reason that I was against term limits was the idea that I thought that there would be like these unintended consequences of having a permanent bureaucracy of lobbyists and staffers who would become the real experts. And I think there could be a similar. You're sort of alluding to a similar problem where the best and the brightest are not going into politics because they can make more money elsewhere. And I guess I would say, I think we should try to pay politicians enough money that we can attract smart, talented people who are not already rich, by the way. If you don't pay them enough, the only people who can afford to do it are really rich people. So I think we need to pay them more money, but I don't think that there should be an expectation that this is a training ground or a way to later cash in.
Not just members, Matt, but also staff, right? I mean, the members, we're talking about how much they make, 170. It's not bad money, right? It's pretty competitive in the job market. But staff, I mean, when I see how much Capitol Hill staff make, it's remarkable. I mean, how are you going to get people to build their career on Capitol Hill if you're only paying them, $40,000?
Yeah. And trust me, if you live in Washington, D.C., and you make $40,000, you are essentially living in poverty. I mean, it's an expensive city. And if you've got a family or something, that is not going to get you very far in your nation's capital.
I think it turns the staff into kind of like a hobby for trust fund kids sometimes. You know what I mean?
Oh, totally. I mean, I think I saw this exact same thing in the media world, where like the only way you could get a job in media was if you moved to DC or New York and basically interned at a media firm. And like, who could afford to move to DC or New York without a job and like work for 6 months for free And so it has this, the ultimately you end up with a whole bunch of people in politics and in media who are super rich, and some of them are really great people, but they're not normal. We can't say that. We can't say they're average. That's for sure.
I do think there is value to somebody who has had practical experience working in a company, in an industry. Politicians do not write our legislation. It is 99% driven by the staffers. So to have true expertise on the inside and on the committees where these folks are writing laws, there needs to be some type of revolving door aspect, because you want the person who has lived the policy at the company, who has worked with the CEOs, the CFOs, the managing directors, implementing policies related to legislation that has come through, understand what the incentives are for the companies. And without that, you just have, an academic professor. Isn't there some merit to those arguments?
Yeah, I mean, I guess when I say revolving door, I'm thinking more of the revolving door going in the direction of members of Congress immediately going into lobbying and sort of leveraging their Rolodexes, their contacts, and in some cases their knowledge, and then cashing in. But I think at some point, what was it? What's the line? I mean, politics is about making sausage, right? And even good politics that's not corrupt is going to look a little messy to some people who aren't familiar with it, right? And so, like, one of the points I make in the book is that I don't have a big problem with rich people who are rich running for office, right? And I think there are a bunch of reasons why rich people run. One of them is that they actually want to do well. They want to give back, right? And in some cases, I think it's there's this transitive property of expertise. They think because they've been successful in one industry that they will be great legislators. And I don't necessarily think the skills are always transferable, but certainly if you've got an experience or knowledge as a small business owner or something, you will be able to represent other small business owners. And you're going to understand some things that I don't understand about government. And so, I mean, look, at the end of the day, if I were like a billionaire, I would be on a beach right now getting drunk. And so I actually admire people who want to, instead of being on a yacht, who want to actually be involved in the public policy process. And I have a certain admiration for it. I think there becomes a problem when we have a situation now where the average member of Congress is, and I'm not talking about the Senate, the upper chamber, or the president. I'm talking about your rank and file House member is like 12 times richer than the average American family. And at a certain point, when it's so ubiquitous, the wealth in Congress, and when the gap is that wide, I do worry that there is something of a disconnect, right? But the real problem isn't even the disconnect in terms of they're richer than we are. The real problem is the notion, the impression that they're using their position to cash in and get richer. That, to me, is the part of the book that's obviously the most concerning.
So let's get into some solutions then. And we just touched on increasing the pay for members of Congress. Can you give us some of the solutions that you think would at least help deal with these massive issues? And there are so many that you raise in this book.
Absolutely. Well, I think the number one most obvious thing we have to do is ban congressional stock trading of individual stocks for members and their families, certainly their spouses, certainly dependent children, right? And I would make an exception for like mutual funds, because that's very hard to rig. But I don't think a blind trust is enough. I think we need to ban individual stock trading. And you know what? Almost everyone agrees. In fact, I think almost everyone in Congress, if you ask them, agrees, and yet it doesn't happen. It never happens because everyone says they agree, but they will find a way to not vote for it through a poison pill or something, right? So that's step one. Another thing we have not talked about today at all because it's not sexy. It's book deals. Members of Congress, a lot of them get rich from book deals. In fact, Ron DeSantis, he's not a member of Congress anymore, but Ron DeSantis just became a millionaire because of a book deal. Ron DeSantis, about 5 years ago, actually had a negative net wealth. As recently as 1 year ago, he was worth about $300,000, according to disclosure reports. As of last month, he is now a millionaire because of a book deal. Bernie Sanders, the socialist, said, they asked him, how is it that you're so rich? And he said, I wrote a best-selling book. You could be a millionaire too if you wrote a best-selling book. There's nothing wrong with writing a best-selling book, but the problem I have with it is, so first of all, in 1991, it became illegal for members of Congress to make money to get paid for giving a speech. And the reason for that is that politicians were using it as a way to have their friends or people who might want to bribe them pay them, I'll go, you want to give me money? I can't take your money, so I'll come give a speech. I'm using scare quotes here, a speech to your local Rotary Club for $10,000 or what. It was a way to funnel money. So politicians could still give speeches. They just can't get paid to give them, right? Now, the new version, in my opinion, are book deals. And the problem is not a book deal. The problem is the bulk orders. So what can happen is, and I'm not saying it always happens, but what can happen is you're a politician and you write a book. Now, it's illegal. It's against the rules for your campaign to bulk order books, but your campaign could advertise it. That's a gray area. What if your campaign spends campaign dollars on their Facebook page to advertise the book? And the money that the politician makes from that goes into royalties that goes into the politician's pocket. What if the National Republican Campaign Committee decides to buy 1,000 books or 5,000 books to give away to donors? That's going to make, you're going to sell books. Now you're going to make the New York Times bestseller list, which is going to mean you sell even more books to real people, which is going to mean that you're going to make more royalties and probably get a better advance on the next book. So I think that this is an area that is kind of boring to talk about, but it's actually one of the most important things. I think we should, you should not be able to make money writing a book as a member of Congress. You can write a book. You shouldn't be able to make money off the royalties or the advance, in my opinion. So those are just a few of the things. I mentioned term limits earlier. I think term limits are something. We've mentioned paying them more. I think we should pay them more because you're not going to make money from books anymore. You're not going to make money from the stock market anymore. Pay them a little more. These are really common sense reforms, and yet they're not happening.
Matt, it's funny you're talking about this because you mentioned that Ron DeSantis became a best-selling author with his new book, and I'm thinking, God, who would want to read that? But then I remember that the super PACs and so on are the ones buying all this stuff. And I mean, that brings us to another reform that we've got to address, which is the campaign finance thing. But I mean, I think, we were talking about paying them more. Maybe that will satisfy them to not seek money from other sources. And I think that really brings us to why this is such a difficult problem. And that's that there's never enough money. And we talk about the rich politicians and hopefully, maybe if they've already got all their money, you're satisfied with your billions, you should be on a beach, but maybe instead you're going to, put your effort towards public service. But we find that even the billionaires are not satisfied with how much they have. And even they are trying to work the system and find ways that they can keep getting more. We find that people only compare themselves up and they don't compare themselves down. I remember the Clintons talking about when we left the White House, we were poor. We didn't have enough money to buy houses, plural, because the people in their circle at that point, who were other elites, had more money than them and they felt inadequate, even though they were the highest paid politicians in the U.S. government at $400,000 a year. You talk about how McDonnell and his wife were, even though they were moving into the beautiful governor's mansion in Virginia, felt like they didn't have nice enough clothes compared to other people that were around them. And I think that that's just greed, isn't it? I mean, that's the human instinct. You compare yourself up and not down, and you're never satisfied with how much you have. And that's why we have to have rules that constrain those human instincts.
Absolutely. It's the hedonic treadmill. And it happens to me. If you had told me 25 years ago or something like, yeah, you're going to be on TV, you're going to write a book and you're going to be on TV talking about politics, I would have been like, man, I'm done. I'm going to be a rock star. It's going to be an amazing life. And it's like, but now I get to do some cool stuff. And it's like, why is that guy on Morning Joe and I'm not this morning? How come they sold more books than I? It's never enough. I think that's the human condition. And, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government and we wouldn't need these reforms. And I do want to say, I am not, as a center-right person, I am not a utopian. Like, I don't think we live in a fallen world. I don't think there's any way to fix our problems, quote unquote. What I think we can do is through reforms that we must be constantly making adjustments as technology changes, as the world changes. We have to be implementing wise reforms to mitigate the problems and to tamp down on the temptations. And so I don't have any notion that this is going to solve any of the problems. What I think we can do is make things better. And I think the stakes are super high because we need to restore trust in our officials, our elected officials, and in our institutions and our government. But we are humans, and so there will be no perfect government in this world, at least.
Matt, I want to thank you again for joining us and congratulate you here on the publishing of your book.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, please get the book. And thanks for a great conversation.